98 feet long, 545,000 pounds, twin engines producing 6,600 horsepower, the largest diesel locomotives ever built. And Union Pacific left them here, lined up in the Mojave at Yermo, California, to rot. Not after a wreck, not after some catastrophic failure. The railroad parked its most powerful machines and walked away. For over a decade, the DDA-40X Centennials hauled priority freight across the American West, each one logging roughly 2 million miles. They were built to dominate, and they did. But by August 1980, every single one sat in storage. The locomotive didn't fail. The job it was built for stopped existing. The desert has a way of swallowing history, but some things are too massive to be buried. In the high scrub of the Mojave, the storage tracks at Yermo became an industrial mausoleum. Dozens of these mechanical titans sat coupled nose to tail, their yellow paint baking under the California sun, slowly fading to a chalky, pale orange. The stillness in the yard was absolute, broken only by the hot wind whistling through empty radiator grills and the metallic groans of expanding steel. For nearly a century, Union Pacific had operated on a singular, aggressive philosophy. Giant power was the key to conquering the West. If a mountain grade slowed a train down, the solution was not to couple more standard locomotives together, but to build a single, larger, more dominant machine. The Centennial was designed to be the absolute culmination of that grand tradition, a custom-built flag bearer for a railroad that demanded absolute supremacy over the rails. Yet there they sat, parked in long parallel lines, their massive iron flanks casting long shadows over the desert gravel. This was far more than a temporary pause in service. When Union Pacific crews severed the traction motor leads and drained the lubricants, they did so with a calculated corporate finality. The railroad that had worked hand-in-hand with builders to design these custom giants simply locked the heavy cab doors and walked away. They chose this isolated, arid climate because the lack of humidity would slow the inevitable corrosion, freezing the fleet in a state of suspended decay. To understand why this happened is to look past the steel and examine a quiet, systemic collapse. How does an industry reach a point where its ultimate achievement, the largest diesel locomotive ever built, is worth more sitting silent in the dust than moving freight? The sheer physical footprint of the Centennial defied standard railroad manufacturing. At 98 feet and 5 inches, from coupler to coupler, the frame was so long that the electromotive division of General Motors could not build it inside their own production facilities. EMD's assembly bays simply lacked the clearances required to manufacture a single, continuous piece of steel of that magnitude. Instead, the builders had to contract the structural work to the John Moore Company, an outside heavy fabrication firm based in Chicago. This was not a standard production locomotive stretched by a few feet. It was a custom-built steel plate giant that required specialized industrial engineering just to bring its foundation into existence. Beneath this massive frame sat an enormous fuel tank designed to sustain the locomotive across the vast distances of the American West. When fully loaded, this tank held 8,000 gallons of diesel fuel, adding 30 tons of dead weight to an already historic axle load. This massive platform existed for one reason: to carry an unprecedented concentration of diesel power. Rather than utilizing a single large engine, designers packed 2 complete EMD 645E 3AV16 prime movers onto the single frame. Each of these 16-cylinder turbocharged powerhouses generated 3,300 horsepower. Together, they delivered a combined output of 6,600 horsepower, a figure that remains unmatched for a single-frame diesel-electric locomotive. This twin-engine configuration effectively made the Centennial 2 high-performance road switchers permanently welded together under a single cab. The mechanical complexity was staggering. Every unit required 2 separate main generators, 2 independent cooling systems with their own massive radiator fans, and two complex exhaust manifolds routing gas through the roof. The operating burden of such a machine was immediate and unrelenting. Keeping two independent prime movers synchronized and functioning in harmony demanded immense technical precision. If one engine suffered a mechanical failure, the locomotive lost half its power, but still had to drag its own massive 270-ton weight over mountain passes. The maintenance routine was doubled. Mechanics had 32 cylinders, 32 fuel injectors, and dual electrical cabinets to inspect, service, and repair for every single locomotive that entered the shop. Yet, for a railroad obsessed with pulling power and speed, this mechanical extremity was a price worth paying. The result was a machine capable of producing over 113,000 pounds of starting tractive effort, designed to run at sustained speeds of up to 90 miles per hour with thousands of tons of priority freight in tow. This appetite for extreme machines was not a sudden pivot, but the continuation of a century-long corporate dogma. For Union Pacific, horsepower was a strategic cudgel used to flatten the grades of the American West. When mountain bottlenecks threatened traffic flow, Union Pacific's response was always to build bigger. In the steam era, this philosophy produced the articulated 4664 Challengers, followed by the colossal 4884 Big Boys, designed to drag heavy freight over the Wasatch Mountains without helper engines. When steam died, the railroad experimented with massive gas turbine electric locomotives, desperate to keep the concept of concentrated single-unit power alive. By the late 1960s, the railroad faced a critical transition. Modern diesel technology was advancing, but standard offerings failed to satisfy Omaha's leadership. Union Pacific bought 50 SD-45 locomotives from EMD, expecting these 20-cylinder machines to solve their high-speed freight demands. Instead, the SD-45s became a strategic disappointment. They suffered from severe reliability issues, including crankshaft failures and high fuel consumption, while still requiring the railroad to couple multiple units together to move priority trains. To Union Pacific management, coupling 3 or 4 standard locomotives together was an operational compromise. An internal 1967 study concluded that the basic maintenance cost of a locomotive remained relatively flat, regardless of its size or power. Under this economic logic, a single, massive locomotive was infinitely more efficient to maintain than 3 smaller ones. The failure of the SD-45 did not convince the railroad to scale back its ambitions. Instead, it proved to management that they needed to build something far larger. The directive went out to design a machine that would completely eclipse the failures of the past and outpower every locomotive ever built. On May 10, 1969, the eyes of the transportation industry turned to Promontory Summit, Utah. Union Pacific was celebrating the centennial of the driving of the Golden Spike, the historic milestone that had first linked the American continent by rail. To mark this anniversary, the railroad paired its historical legacy with a bold projection of its future. On May 7th, just 3 days before the ceremony, builders delivered unit number 6900. It was the first of a planned class of 47 giant locomotives, and its arrival was rushed to ensure it could serve as the center of the celebration. This new breed of motive power received a name that forever tied its physical dominance to the historic milestone: the Centennial. To further solidify this identity, the railroad reserved a unique block of numbers for the fleet, designating them the 6900 series in direct tribute to the 1869 completion date. The remaining 46 units, delivered in 2 production runs through September 1971, carried this commemorative numbering system. The first batch, numbered 6900 through 6924, arrived during the anniversary year of 1969, while the second batch completed the order 2 years later. With their massive frames and distinct wide-nosed cabs, the Centennials served as rolling symbols of corporate power as well as freight tools. They were mobile, high-speed billboards designed to project the image of an invincible empire. When a Centennial led a train across the flatlands of Nebraska or through the mountain passes of Wyoming, It was a highly visible statement of corporate sovereignty. Union Pacific had built a rolling monument to its own legacy of conquest, plastering its institutional pride across 98 feet of yellow steel. For a railroad that defined itself by unmatched scale, the DDA-40X was the ultimate corporate flagship designed to show the world that Union Pacific still commanded the American West. Between 1976 and 1979, the Centennials entered their peak operational years, transitioning from celebrated flagships to the hardest-working machines on the Union Pacific system. This period was dominated by high-speed, long-distance freight, and the DDA-40X fleet became the backbone of the railroad's priority pool. They were not kept clean for exhibitions or parked in terminal yards to impress onlookers. Instead, Union Pacific pooled these massive engines at the front of priority freight trains, moving thousands of tons of high-value cargo across the vast gaps between Chicago, Council Bluffs, and the West Coast. To achieve high-speed performance, Union Pacific mechanical staff paired the Centennials with specially geared SD-42 units, known on the railroad as the Fast 40s. These standard-frame locomotives were modified with a 59 to 18 gear ratio to match the high-speed capability of the DDA-40X. Running in these matched sets, a single Centennial and two Fast 40s could maintain speeds of up to 80 miles per hour across the flat Nebraska plains and the long, sustained climbs of Wyoming. The sheer volume of work these machines performed during this period was immense. By 1980, less than a decade after the last unit left the assembly floor, each DDA-40X in the 47-unit fleet had accumulated an average of roughly 2 million miles of service. They ran almost continuously, cycled through maintenance shops only for federally mandated inspections and rapid fuel stops before being dispatched back onto the main line. This steady, high-mileage operation proved that the Centennial was a productive industrial tool rather than a mere public relations gimmick. They were designed for brutal, high-speed service. And during these peak years, they delivered exactly what Union Pacific demanded. By August 1980, the thunderous roar of the Centennials came to a sudden, absolute stop. In a matter of weeks, Union Pacific systematically pulled the entire 47-unit fleet from active service and parked them on the deadlines in the desert. This was a swift, total reversal. Less than a year earlier, these engines were the undisputed kings of the main line, running continuously across the West and racking up millions of miles. Now, every single DDA-40X sat completely silent, their yellow steel flanks growing cold in the dry desert air. The standard narrative of industrial retirement usually involves mechanical failure, structural flaws, or fatal design defects. But the Centennial was not an engineering failure. The locomotives had performed exactly as Union Pacific engineered them to, conquering mountain grades, pulling immense tonnage, and running at sustained high speeds. The crisis that sidelined the fleet did not originate within the diesel engines themselves. Instead, the railroad's own operating environment became the antagonist, rendering the giants obsolete. The specific world that birthed these giants had vanished. The work pattern they were designed to dominate no longer existed in the same way. The job they were custom-built to do simply stopped existing. For a century, Union Pacific had staked its future on concentrated, monolithic power, culminating in this twin-engine machine. But by the summer of 1980, the rail industry was shifting beneath their wheels. The operating environment transformed from a system that prized raw, single-unit muscle to one that required a different operational approach. The Centennials were left stranded by this historical shift, suddenly too massive and too specialized for a network that was rapidly redefining how it managed freight. The fleet remained mechanically sound and fully capable of 70-mile-per-hour runs, but the industry itself had moved past them, leaving the world's largest diesels with nowhere left to run. The economic reality of the early 1980s quickly exposed the vulnerability of concentrated power. A sharp recession caused rail traffic to plummet, reducing carloads and leaving Union Pacific with surplus horsepower and empty freight cars. At the same time, the lingering effects of the 1970s energy crises drove diesel fuel prices to unprecedented heights. Feeding a locomotive with an 8,000-gallon fuel tank and two turbocharged prime movers became an indefensible expense. While a Centennial consumed vast quantities of fuel just to move its own 270-ton frame, the standard EMDSD-42 offered a far more efficient ratio of fuel consumption to pulling power, making it the preferred choice for cash-strapped operators. Maintenance costs further widened the divide. Standardizing on simpler single-engine units meant maintenance shops only managed 16 cylinders, one generator, and one electrical cabinet per locomotive. The Centennial required mechanics to service 32 cylinders and dual propulsion systems on a single frame. This doubled the inspection workload for every single run. If a single component failed on one of the Centennial's engines, the entire machine had to be pulled from service, idling a massive capital asset. Conversely, if an SD-42 broke down in a multi-unit consist, crews could easily swap it out, allowing the train to continue running while the disabled unit went to the shop. Under the railroad's internal cost-benefit analysis, the high-horsepower custom fleet had simply become too expensive to keep on the rails. But the fatal disadvantage of the DDA-40X was its complete lack of operational flexibility. A giant locomotive cannot be split. If Union Pacific needed to run two lighter, faster trains on separate branches, a Centennial had to remain on one route, while the railroad found other power for the second train. The modular SD-42 allowed dispatchers to build exactly the horsepower they needed, combining 3 units for a heavy mountain climb or splitting them up to run 3 individual freights. This need for adaptability intensified with the passage of the Staggers Rail Act of 1980. Deregulation allowed railroads to negotiate direct contracts, abandon unprofitable lines, and quickly adjust rates and routes. To maximize efficiency, railroads increasingly engaged in power pooling agreements, sharing standardized locomotives across different corporate systems. This new, fast-moving corporate environment favored standardized, cooperative fleets over custom-built giants, rendering the massive Centennial an expensive relic of a simpler era. In the arid expanse of California's high desert, the Yermo holding tracks did not look like a traditional graveyard. There were no cutting torches, no scrap shears, and no active dismantling. Instead, the dry Mojave atmosphere acted as a preservation chamber. With humidity levels frequently dropping into the single digits, the relentless moisture that typically bubbles paint and rots steel was entirely absent. The desert air effectively paused time, keeping the massive yellow locomotives in a state of suspended preservation. Row after row, the Centennials sat perfectly aligned on the bypass tracks, their massive steel flanks reflecting the shimmering heat waves. To anyone walking the quiet gravel leads, the scene felt less like a scrap line and more like a quiet museum of sleeping giants. The heavy steel frames, too long for standard shops, now stretched out across the desert floor, casting sharp, unchanging shadows as the sun crossed the sky. By choosing this isolated, rain-starved basin, Union Pacific had not yet condemned the fleet to destruction. They had placed the ultimate expression of their high-horsepower era into a deep, atmospheric freeze, waiting to see if the world would ever need them again. The answer came in late 1983. A sharp, unexpected surge in freight traffic caught Union Pacific unprepared, outrunning the capacity of the railroad's active fleet. Omaha suddenly needed immediate horsepower, and plenty of it. While the company had new EMDSD-50 locomotives on order, waiting for those assembly lines to deliver new steel would take months. Months the railroad could not afford to lose. Union Pacific's operations managers ran the numbers. They calculated that pulling the dormant Centennials out of the desert and rebuilding them would be faster and significantly cheaper than waiting for the SD-50 deliveries. The decision lacked any sentimentality. It was a cold, pragmatic business calculation to solve a temporary capacity crisis. Work crews arrived at Yermo and dragged 40 of the giant units out of storage, dispatching them to the North Platte and Salt Lake City shops for rapid overhauls. By February 1984, 25 Centennials had returned to active service. Once again, the massive twin-engine machines led fast freights across the system, paired with standard SD-40-2S to keep tonnage moving. The railroad treated this comeback as a provisional fix, avoiding any triumphant celebration of a permanent resurrection. Union Pacific viewed the Centennials as a short-term bridge to keep the network fluid rather than a long-term solution. They were back on the main line, but their second life was fragile, entirely dependent on a temporary spike in traffic that could vanish as quickly as it had arrived. By April 1984, the limits of this temporary patch were fully exposed. When mechanics inspected the remaining 15 stored units, they found machines too damaged to return to service. Restoring them made no financial sense. On June 25, 1984, Union Pacific issued the formal retirement order for the class, ending any possibility of a full fleet return. What followed was not a dramatic farewell, but a cold, systematic harvest. Since September 1983, the Salt Lake City shops had been running a pick-apart operation. Mechanics stripped prime movers, generators, and electrical assemblies from the non-runners, transplanting these heavy components into high-mileage SD-42s to extend their service lives. The largest diesel ever built had become an organ donor for smaller, more versatile locomotives. Every part taken from a stored Centennial was a permanent step toward the end. The fleet was now a diminishing resource managed through practical triage. Union Pacific did not look at these giants with corporate regret. They saw usable steel and components to keep other trains moving. The brief revival was over, leaving behind a line of stripped frames and empty engine bays. The everyday logistics of the Salt Lake City diesel shops dictated the final fate of the DDA-40X. Beginning in September 1983, Union Pacific dragged these silent giants off the storage tracks and hauled them to Utah. These machines arrived at the maintenance bays to be systematically gutted. The physical process was cold and direct. Shop crews severed the heavy electrical cables, unbolted the massive structural mounts, and used overhead cranes to hoist the 16-cylinder EMD 645 E3A engines directly out of the Centennial frames. These were the very prime movers that had once delivered a combined 6,600 horsepower. Once separated, they were lowered into the empty engine compartments of high-mileage SD-42 road switchers. This transplant operation represented a stark corporate irony. The DDA-40X, engineered to be the supreme flagship of the Union Pacific fleet, became a static parts bin. Its high-performance components were harvested to keep smaller, more common locomotives running. A single Centennial supplied 2 complete diesel engines, 2 main generators, and the electrical cabinets, sacrificed so that 2 separate SD-42s could remain on the line. For Union Pacific's accountants, the decision was simple arithmetic. The giant was a niche asset, but its organs were fully compatible with the standard workhorses of the railroad. By stripping the biggest diesels ever built, the railroad saved millions in component replacement costs, leaving behind empty, hollowed-out steel shells. The temporary reprieve of the late 1983 traffic surge could not hold. By December 1984, all 25 resurrected Centennials were pulled from the main line and returned to the quiet storage lines. The brief operational revival was over. Only a single locomotive remained to represent the class in regular service. This lone survivor, number 6936, operated as the last active face of a class of giants already living on borrowed time. On May 5, 1985, Number 6936, coupled to the front of a fast freight train in Los Angeles. Over the next 2 days, the massive twin-engine locomotive led its consist east toward Chicago, roaring through mountain passes and crossing the open plains on its final regular revenue run. When the train arrived in Chicago on May 6, 1985, the era of DDA 40X revenue service officially ended. The ultimate high-horsepower diesel had completed its last regular assignment. It was a quiet finish, transitioning the giant from an active tool of commerce into a silent relic of a railroad philosophy that the industry had left behind. Of the 47 Centennials built, 13 survived the scrapper's torch, yet the word preservation suggests a completeness that rarely existed for these massive road switchers. For most of these survivors, retirement meant a permanent state of hollowed-out exile, separating the surviving steel shells from the actual engines that once roared across the West. In 1986, Union Pacific donated number 6916 to the Utah State Railroad Museum in Ogden. The railroad handed over the locomotive as is, which was a polite term for a gutted carcass. Before the donation, Salt Lake City shop forces had stripped the cab interior and removed every major mechanical component to keep other locomotives running. Visitors to the museum look at a monumental yellow facade, but beneath the metal roof hatches lies a completely empty cavern. This separation of cosmetic display from mechanical reality continued for decades. In October 2024, a local heritage group relocated the shell of number 6925 from a yard in Chamberlain to Kimball, South Dakota. While local organizers plan to display the locomotive, it remains a hollow monument. Decades of industrial cannibalization left the unit completely stripped of both 16-cylinder diesel engines and the vast majority of its heavy electrical gear, leaving behind a massive steel platform devoid of its original dual propulsion systems. Only one unit escaped this systematic gutting. Number 6936, the survivor of that final 1985 run, remained inside Union Pacific's heritage fleet for decades. In April 2022, the railroad donated the giant to the railroading heritage of Midwest America in Silvis, Illinois. Because it stayed protected within the company's official fleet, its internal organs remained intact. By the summer of 2023, mechanics had restored the twin prime movers to running condition, making 6936 the only operational Centennial left on Earth. It is a solitary living machine, while its 12 surviving sisters exist only as silent, hollow monuments of steel. Today, the Desert Mausoleum at Yermo stands as a monument to a vanished philosophy. The Centennial didn't fail. The job it was built to do simply stopped existing. In a modern rail network ruled by standardized efficiency, these giants became mere parts bins for lesser machines. They remain the ultimate monuments to an era of raw muscle we will never see again. What do you think of this giant's legacy? Share your thoughts below.